I'm going to play you something twice. Tell me which one you think is louder. Did you catch the difference? I'm going to tell you which one actually was louder in a moment, but which one do you think was louder? Was it option A or option B? Even though one seems louder than the other, both of these tracks are playing back and peaking at the same level. In other words, these are equally as loud as one another. You might actually be thinking that option B sounds louder, especially when it reverts back to option A and you hear the difference between them. But that's because in option B, I've actually increased the perceived loudness of that track, effectively making it seem louder even though it isn't. What exactly is perceived loudness? Loudness itself refers to the physical measurement of sound intensity, typically quantified in decibels or dB. It's an objective measurement of the amount of sound energy present in a sound wave. Perceived loudness, on the other hand, is the subjective perception of how loud a sound is to a human listener. It takes into account not only the physical characteristics of the sound, but also the response of the human auditory system and individual perceptual factors. This illusion can come in handy when mixing, especially when you want something to feel louder or fuller in a mix, but without making it peak or clip. So how exactly do you increase perceived loudness? I've uncovered 3 methods that I use to increase perceived loudness in my mixes, and I'm going to share them with you today in this video. Let's look at the first method, and that is to increase average volume, or RMS. RMS is root mean square and essentially refers to the average volume of a signal. A signal typically varies in volume depending on the type of sound it is, with some points being loudest and others being much quieter. These variances in volume are referred to as dynamics. Simply put, the more a sound fluctuates in terms of volume, the more dynamic it is. The maximum difference between the loudest and quietest moments are known as the dynamic range. In order to increase the average volume of a signal, we actually need to reduce the dynamic range of a signal and then increase its overall volume. When it comes to reducing dynamic range, we'll look no further than using a compressor or its more aggressive sibling, a limiter. By using a compressor or limiter, we can tame the transient peaks, which are typically the loudest moments, to create more headroom. With more headroom available, we can add more gain to our signal overall, allowing us to make up volume on those now reduced loud moments, but also fully benefiting the quieter moments which haven't been reduced at all. I do this across my entire mix, on individual tracks, groups, and even on the master level, slowly but surely increasing the perceived loudness throughout each stage of compression that I apply. For this example, we're going to focus on applying a compressor to my instrumental group. This is where all my instrumental sounds go, such as drums, basses, pads, leads, and more. Basically, everything that comprises the instrumental is on this track. Let's get some starter settings going with a 2:1 ratio, which isn't as aggressive, a fast attack, and a fast release. Of course, we're going to tailor these settings more, but this is just where we're going to start. From here, we're going to want to bring down our threshold until we start to see some gain reduction taking place within the compressor. I typically aim for somewhere between 1 to 4 dB of gain reduction, but typically more to start before I ease up later to achieve a more transparent sound. Let's do that together right now. Now that we're achieving gain reduction, we can actually back off on the attack and release to create a more transparent sound. And now you can see we're actually achieving less gain reduction, but that's okay because we're still getting some compression out of this, especially on those louder hits for this example, such as the kick and the snare, which are really loud and dynamic and triggering this compression in the first place. Let's now focus on adding makeup gain back to our signal, and I'm going to just do this by ear, knowing that we're losing roughly 2 dB, and I'm going to try to just perfectly match that as best as I can. Let's go. So in this example, we're adding back 0.9 dB of gain. Even though we're losing upwards of 2 dB, that's not how much we're consistently losing, but that's the maximum amount we might be losing at a given point. However, 0.9 dB felt about right. It feels like we're just able to match the level before we applied the compression, but we're also able to benefit from this compression in the sense of we're creating a more consistent sound. You could hear the sustain of the instrumental coming up a little bit more, which again increases that consistency and makes it easier to perceive, therefore increasing the perceived loudness of this specific example. Now, I know I ran through this quickly, but if you want a more detailed breakdown of compression and how to use it in a mix, click the card you're going to see on screen right now or the link in the description below to see some of my most popular compression videos available, all in the form of a playlist that's very simple and straightforward for you to watch step by step. Now, another method I use to increase perceived loudness in my mixes is to create separation. There are often many sounds fighting for a listener's attention in a mix, from the vocal to the instruments, effects, and beyond. By creating more separation in a mix with the methods that I'm about to show you, you're going to be able to reduce the competition between sounds, improving their cohesion, and ultimately improving the perceived loudness not only of each individual sound, but your mix as a whole. Simply put, the less your sounds fight with each other, the easier it'll be to hear them. Now, there's many ways to create separation between sounds, and I'm working on a video to showcase them all, but for now, let's look at two of my favorite methods. The first being subtractive EQ. Sounds are made up of frequencies, and it's not unusual for frequencies between sounds to overlap at times and mask each other, reducing the clarity and separation between them. To improve this, I like to use subtractive EQ on competing sounds only, carefully carving out frequencies that are masking each other. Some tools make identifying frequency overlap very easy, like the FabFilter Pro Q3, which allows you to set the frequency analyzer to another sound, and it'll highlight any frequency masking on your mix in red, like so. Now, if you don't have the Pro Q3, which I highly recommend you get, by the way, it's my favorite EQ and my go-to for sure, you can simply add any EQ that you have and then sweep around until you find the fundamental frequency or most impactful frequency on a given sound, like so. So on this particular sound, somewhere around 730 seems to be a very dominant and prominent frequency that's important to this particular track. Once you've identified this frequency, you can go into a competing sound and reduce that frequency in the same area until your preferred primary sound is more present. So in this example, I have the pad and I have the keys here that are basically competing with each other during this section. You can see they're overlapping with one another. And knowing on the pad that I've identified 730 hertz is an important frequency, I could go into the keys, I could identify 730, and I could easily subtract from this frequency, playing both tracks together until I could just hear the pad coming up a bit more. So let's just make sure we know what we're listening for. I'll solo the pad. Very much reverberated, affected piano, very similar to the keys in a lot of ways, so I can understand why there's overlap. Let's actually now solo the keys and just hear what that sounds like. So you got a Rhodes type of piano or an electric piano playing some lower kind of octave notes as well as some higher melody type of stuff. So if I put them together now, and I'm going to open up the EQ for the keys, I'll set this back to 0. Let's play both and just bring down the gain until I start to hear those pads coming up a little bit more. Now, while this works statically in this example, I personally prefer to do this dynamically, which means using a dynamic EQ. That way, the frequencies on competing sounds are only reduced when they're both playing simultaneously in the arrangement, and that way it's the least intrusive. It's not going to get rid of stuff statically or all the time. It'll be a lot more transparent that way, and again, only get rid of something when it's a problem. I've done a whole video series on frequency masking and creating separation through that method already, so be sure to click the video you see in the top corner of the screen or in the description below to watch that and learn this technique of using dynamic EQ to solve frequency masking more in depth. Now, the second method I like to use to create separation between sounds is stereo imaging. This is really just a fancy way of saying panning, although it could definitely refer to fancier stereo imaging processing, such as using a stereo widener, for example. Now, one of the simplest ways to create separation between sounds is to simply pan them into their own respective place in the stereo field. This helps reduce their chances of masking each other and will make your mix feel more spacious and impactful. Now, some sounds definitely shouldn't be panned for mono compatibility purposes, primarily being low-end sounds such as the kick or the bass, as well as the snare and lead vocal, to name a few. However, any complementary sounds that are not necessarily the main focus should be panned around the stereo field. So for example, I commonly pan pads, keyboards, hi-hats, and other percussion instruments around the stereo field to create more separation between them and the main sounds. And it's worth noting that these are not usually the main or lead instruments, but rather sounds that are enhancing the lead instruments or acting as accessories to them. Now, in this example, I panned some accessory sounds that I identified in the mix, specifically the percussion, the hi-hat, the synth, the keys, and the pad, all because they overlap each other in the arrangement, and they're not necessarily those main sounds that I discussed, like the kick, snare, lead instrument, and so on. I wanted to create some more space between them, so in this case, I decided to rely on panning, and to do that, I used Isotope's Relay plugin, and just used the panning section primarily to ultimately put them into their own spot. And I'm just literally using this because I have a bunch of stereo tracks, and stereo tracks have two pan pots. I don't want to have to figure that out. That's a bit annoying for me, so instead I'm using a single plugin that'll allow me to pan the whole thing more into the left or the right. It's much simpler this way, but you can absolutely still use the pan pot built into your channel in the DAW of your choice. So that being said, you can see that each one has its own little field here. Perk is 20 to the left, the hi-hat is 20 to the right, the synth is 30 to the right, the keys are 30 to the left, and the pad is 10 to the left. So now let's play this without this panning. Just pay attention and notice how everything is still very clean, but ultimately still on top of each other. And the second that I enable this panning, you're going to see how things just sort of spread out a little bit more, become a little bit more clear, and also just more interesting because there's more space. Check this out. So again, just creating that spaciousness in the mix, and a very simple method of doing so. No EQ, no compression, none of that required. Just use the stuff built directly into your DAW, the simple stuff being panning. Now, the third way that I like to increase the perceived loudness of a sound is by enhancing harmonic content. As we've established, sounds are made up of frequencies. However, us humans, we don't perceive all frequencies equally. For example, take a listen to these two clips. The first one is a 50 Hz signal at minus 20 dB, and the second is a 1000 Hz signal also at minus 20 dB. They're effectively both the same level, but listen closely and tell me which one you think is louder, once again, just like before. Now, if you're human, there's a good chance that that second 10 kilohertz signal sounded louder to your ears. But as we've discussed, they're both matched in terms of volume. So what gives? Why is the 10K appearing louder than the 50 hertz in this example? There's something called the Fletcher Munson curves, which I'm going to put on screen right now. And this graph showcases how humans perceive different frequencies. Most importantly, it shows how loud each frequency needs to be in order to have an equal level of loudness. In other words, all frequencies are not the same. They are perceived differently. differently, and as you can see in this graph, lower frequencies need to be much louder in order to match the loudness of mid and higher frequencies, which are easily picked up by our ears. So to put this all together, in order to increase the perceived loudness of our tracks, we can focus on increasing the presence of higher end harmonic frequencies on a track, those frequencies that are easier for us humans to perceive. And the way that we do that is through harmonic distortion. Now, what are harmonics? Harmonics are integer multiples of a fundamental frequency. I know that sounds like mumbo jumbo, so let me explain it like this. For example, if a fundamental frequency of a sound is 100 hertz, then the second harmonic of that frequency would be 100 hertz times 2, which is 200 hertz. This is followed by the third harmonic, which would be 100 hertz times 3, which is 300 hertz, and so on. This continues for as long as you decide, although keep in mind we can only hear up to roughly 20K, maybe not as much depending on if you're a drummer. Now with that in mind, we can use specific forms of processing to enhance higher harmonics of the frequencies that make up our sound, and that ultimately enhances them and improves their perceived loudness. Now you can achieve this by applying harmonic distortion. Harmonic distortion can refer to a variety of processing from actual distortion units to saturation, overdrives, tube amps, bit crushers, and so on. Harmonic distortion ultimately adds musical overtones to the fundamental frequency of a sound, which enhances it, somewhat similar to an EQ enhancing frequencies, but in a different way, as it's enhancing frequencies based on the sound being fed into it. This tends to make the sound more musical and pleasing to our ears. Now, if I put this directly onto a sound, I really try to dial in a distortion sound that is more high-end focused, and that's because us humans tend to perceive high frequencies better than low ones. Low ones we tend to feel more than we hear, depending on what level it's at. So in the case of this example, I've got a distortion applied to a vocal here, and I'm just going to dial some settings in quickly using the Magma BB tubes, but of course you can apply this to any saturation device you prefer.
Speak that gibberish, please. Yabba dabba doo dabba dee. I know that your dad is gone so wrong, but it's me and you now, my firstborn. But you ain't a baby no more. Take that bottle out your mouth. You a big brother, mean you a role model now. You got new responsibilities. Your ability to cope with humiliation is humility. Boy, I've never seen a man take a loss to a heart. Yeah, you young, but this is where your real life starts. Speak that gibberish, please. Yabba dabba doo dabba dee. I know that your dad is gone so wrong, but it's me and you.
So I don't mind these settings. What I'm going to do is just quickly try to volume match this using the output.
Speak that gibberish, please. Yabba dabba doo dabba dee. I know that your dad is gone so wrong, but it's me and you now, my firstborn. But you ain't a baby no more. Take that bottle out your mouth. You a big brother, mean you a role model now. You got new responsibilities. Your ability to cope with humiliation is humility. Boy, I've never seen.
I more so just want this to enhance and saturate what I'm applying it to in a delicate way so that it's still transparent but ultimately enhanced. But of course, if you want to dial it up even further and make it a bit more pronounced, you absolutely can. Saturation itself is one of my favorite techniques when mixing, especially vocals, so click the card you see on screen right now to watch a video I did all about saturation and how to apply it to vocals specifically to enhance them, just like I've done here. I appreciate you guys for watching. Don't forget to like the video if you got value out of it and subscribe if you're new. I'll see y'all next time. Peace.
5